Polovina od superizborната година веќе е зад нас. Изборите на европско тло завршија на овој или оној начин. Сега, со иста таква состојба и со исто толку жестоко предизборие, се соочува најголемиот европски сојузник – Соединетите Американски држави. Добре дојдовте во уште еден Лабиринт. Јас сум Кристина Атовска. На темите кои ги споменав, тероризмот и како да се одбраниме од него на глобално ниво, разговарам со мојот денешен гостин од Соединетите Американски држави, Джейкоб Вер, кој е истражувач во Советот за надворешни односи на САД. Mr. Ware, thank you very much for accepting this interview. It's an honor to talk with a professional from the United States on some very important issues like security and terrorism and counterterrorism.
No, of course. I'm happy to be here. Honored to speak with you as well. Looking forward to it.
Mr. Ware, let's start with the latest news from United States of America. It's been a while since the assassination attempt of the candidate for the president, Mr. Trump. So what are the latest information concerning this assassination attempt, and are there more threats? Because as we know, the presidential campaign is ongoing and there is plenty of time until the election day. So what is the security situation at the moment?
Excellent questions. I think, first of all, it's important to note that we suffered a very dark day in our country's history when President Trump narrowly avoided assassination about a month and a week ago in a place called Butler, Pennsylvania. It was a very serious incident. My understanding is we were spared a more serious outcome by millimeters. And so the first thing is, we're very fortunate to still that the event wasn't worse. From the counterterrorism standpoint, what you're really looking for is motive, right? You're trying to figure out why this happened, what the individual was driven by, why they targeted, the former president. And to be honest, we just don't have those answers yet. And we might never get those answers. We have to be realistic about that as well. It seems that this is somebody who was floating largely outside of the political system, did not necessarily adhere to any one ideology, was not necessarily radicalized beyond a desire for violence. And so much like some of the prior major assassinations that we've had in our country's history, like the most recent attempted presidential assassination of Ronald Reagan in the 80s, we might not get a clear motive. Maybe this is just one of those things that happened. Clearly, there were serious security failures, and I expect that there'll be congressional committees with regards to the Secret Service failure in this incident, in this case, how this person was able to get so close to the target with the firearm that he had. But that will play out over the next few years, trying to find out why that happened. The last part of your question on the security situation heading into the election, I will borrow a cliche that counterterrorism people like to use a lot, which is the alarms are flashing red. What I mean by that is we are at a very elevated threat environment here in the US. Now, I think the baseline is we should expect to see violence in this election cycle. That isn't as scary as it sounds, because really, actually, we see violence in most US election cycles. Of course, we all remember January 6th. I think many of your listeners will remember the attempted assassination of our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, in the last midterm election. So it's not uncommon that we see violence. I think what is uncommon is that you have the volume of possible targets, the volume of what you might call opportunity in the next three months. We have multiple factions of our political system that are very animated, very mobilized towards violence. We have many targets in our country that might find themselves in the crosshairs. And so it is a very frightening few months ahead of us in terms of counterterrorism. We should expect to see violence, I think.
So are the measures being up, security measures and security issues, are there more force included in this campaign after the assassination attempt?
You would expect that there's a stronger law enforcement posture. But I think part of the problem is in counterterrorism, we usually think of a threat in terms of three things. It's almost like an equation of intent, capability, and opportunity. So when those three things kind of come together, that's when you might see a heightened threat. We know the intent is high. We've seen it in data, and that's part of the reason why we've seen so much violence in the US over the past 10, 15 years. We know that motivation or intent to violence is higher than usual. Capability in the US is always high. That's the real issue, is people always have a capability to commit violence because of our gun culture. So it's really, unlike many European countries, for example, it is not hard to find the means to commit an act of violence. And then we have this opportunity. And that's the really frightening thing, Christina, is with the amount of potential targets for violence, that includes polling places, so places where people vote, tallying places, so places where the votes are counted, all the politicians, right, all the government buildings, all of those locations, you can't possibly protect them all from a police perspective. It's impossible. So the volume of opportunity is high, and I think that is what's making this moment so frightening.
But when we watch American TV stations, we can see that the people are not acting like they are afraid. They are keep going to conventions, to political meetings and gatherings. It doesn't look like anyone is afraid. Are the citizens right to feel safe, or maybe they should feel with a little bit more concern when they are visiting political events?
Listen, I think it's always important when you face a threat of terrorism, when you face a threat of violence, to continue your activities as normal, right? It's kind of a emotional plea, but when violence tries to divide us, we have to stay the course. We have to come together. So I think that is one of the reasons why you see that. Now, how that might change if you see a shooting, for example, at a polling place early in the cycle or early on the day of the election, that might well change behavior, right? That might change the way that people react. But you're pulling at a really interesting thread here, and it's something that I deal with, I would say, ethically in my profession, which is you are warning. I mean, part of my job is to identify trends and threats and warn about them and suggest that we might be facing a threat environment. But at the same time, you really don't want to do the terrorists' job for them, because obviously they are trying to terrorize, they're trying to divide people, they're trying to change behavior. And we really don't want people to change their behavior. We want people to engage in a robust, thriving democratic process. And so trying to balance those two things is tricky, but I'm glad you've noticed that people are continuing to stay the course. I'm glad that's the impression we're giving. It's really important that remains the case.
Well, all the halls are full. It's basically impossible not to see the atmosphere during political conventions, parties conventions, and their meetings in every American country. I have to ask, is it possible that this kind of events, like the assassination attempt and the fear and the threats, can they influence on the election day, on the result of the election day, or the citizens already know who they are going to give their vote for?
I think it's possibly unlikely to change people's opinions, but it might change people's behaviors. And I think that's part of the goal of the violent extremists. I'm not sure that high-profile assassinations or assassination attempts will make people feel dramatically different about the candidates. I mean, maybe there's a counter argument that President Trump saw a bump in his polls after the assassination attempt against him. But what I think is a more likely scenario is that if people notice that violence has risen and that there's a greater threat against the locations that they might go to on election day, for example, I think it's more likely that people might stay home and might just decide, you know what, I'm not going to participate. And that's obviously devastating. One thing that we have noticed in America that is a real issue, and it's a low-level issue, is since 2020, when President Trump, of course, tried to, let's be real, he tried to steal an election. He tried to get people to find votes for him, for example. A lot of his vitriol, a lot of his energy was directed towards local level election officials. So in our country, we have obviously a massive electoral system, obviously a massive vote, and a lot of that is maintained by volunteers who work at the local level to, for example, count votes in their constituency. I'm sure it's the same, over in your country. Those people have been threatened violently at unprecedented levels by violent extremists who are saying, these people are lackeys of the deep state and they're stealing the election and all this. And increasingly, we are seeing those people, those volunteers, opt not to participate, opt not to do their jobs. And that is a major threat to democracy and to our system. If the people who maintain our robust democracy, maintain our robust elections, by being volunteers, by participating, by being patriotic defenders of our country and its institutions, if they decide not to do that anymore because they're worried about threats against them, you can see that the whole system kind of would fall apart. And so that is a real threat. It's not people changing their opinions, it's people changing their behaviors and changing the way that they engage in our democracy.
And I have to ask you about your latest book about far-right terrorism in America. Far-right is an issue this year in Europe because the far-right parties were rising in this past period of time, these past months. So what about the threats that far-right can bring? It's your specialty, so what are your deepest concerns about far-right terrorism in the United States?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for bringing up the book. We did co-author a book earlier this year, and it published in January, God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America. Just one little, not correction, but additional point of context is you can't just study far-right terrorism in America without looking at Europe. And so, yes, the focus of our book is how this movement rose in America, but of course, these ideologies, they bounce across oceans, right? And Americans are inspired by European far-right extremists, and Europeans are inspired by Americans. The best example of what this looks like for your region, although I appreciate it's not too close, I think is what happened in Bratislava in October 2022, when there was a shooting at a gay bar in Bratislava that killed 2 people, perpetrated by a white supremacist. Now, the really interesting thing about that individual is he wrote his manifesto in English, so he was trying to appeal to a global movement. He was inspired by events in America. He wrote about, for example, abortion law in America, writing that it wasn't enough of a victory for American white people. And so these ideas, they bounce across oceans. You have people in your part of the world, in Europe writ large, who are inspired by Americans, and these things bounce back and forth. My biggest concern, Christina, is a lot of the violence that we've seen, both in Europe and the United States, is inspired by a conspiracy theory called Great Replacement Theory. When you look at the string of violence that we've seen from places like Oslo in 2011 to Christchurch in New Zealand in 2019, to El Paso in Texas in 2019, to Buffalo, New York in 2022, to Bratislava in 2022, they are inspired by this conspiracy theory called Great Replacement Theory, which says that white people in Europe and the United States and Australia, for example, are being steadily replaced by non-white people through immigration and minority political rights in a process that is being deliberately orchestrated by Marxists and Jews. The reason why this worries me so much isn't because it's counter to democracy and to thriving liberal democracy, right? It is, but that's less the problem. It is that these conspiracy theories are extremely big tent, to use a word that we have to use an English phrase, which means there are a lot of groups within this conspiracy theory that can be targeted. So if you have this mindset that, right, your position as a white person is being eroded, you are being driven out of your country by non-white people, by Jews, by Marxists, basically everybody else in society is to blame, right? Black people are to blame.
Starting from the media?
Including the media, because the media would, of course, be the Marxists who are driving this. So the media, Black people, immigrants, Jewish people, the left, government officials, everybody's targeted. And so the interesting thing about that Bratislava case is he actually, first of all, intended to go commit a shooting at a synagogue. He decided to go to a government building next, I think. And finally, his third target was the gay community in Bratislava. He had so many targets he could go to that he was almost spoiled for choice. And so if these conspiracy theories develop a real grounding in our countries, if they really become widespread, the threat to different constituents in our countries is going to be enormous. It's going to be enormous, and people are going to be unsafe in their communities. And that is really, really frightening, because to go back to what I said earlier, that is a serious threat to the liberal democracies that we are trying to build. It is completely incompatible with them. So the conspiracy theories, the ideas here, they are very, very frightening. They are very dangerous.
Yes, we understand that here on the Balkans, it happens all the time. For us, we have really, really serious issues with conspiracy theories and people who believe in that kind of theories. So lately, a few months ago, we had a terrorist attack in Belgrade, in Serbian capital, in front of the Israeli embassy. One police officer was attacked, and it was the first case of that kind here on the Balkans. So can we expect more of these cases in near future? Because we know European, Central and Western European countries, they're all on high alert on terrorism. Of course, we have behind us the Olympic Games. It was there were big concerns, but everything went well, thanks God. But now we have really more challenges in front of us, because we can see the movement on the Balkans and on the whole Europe. So what is your assessment about European continent in the next month?
I think one of the issues that we're having here in the US and in Western Europe, and I'd be interested for your thoughts on this in the Balkans, is we're facing what my co-author and I have called the counterterrorism dilemma. Let me explain this from the US perspective, and we can see if this is something that would apply for you as well. The counterterrorism dilemma is the reality that in the United States and in major European capitals, policymakers want to move away from counterterrorism towards great power competition, strategic competition. So counterterrorism has obviously dominated our foreign policy and national security for the past 20 years. people now want to focus on China and Russia, of course, and Iran, right? Near peer or great power or strategic competition. That transition is obviously taking resources away from counterterrorism. At the same time, that our terrorist threats that we're facing are actually multiplying. So we're facing a rising threat from the far right. That is kind of my world. We are facing a rising threat from far left terrorism. And we are facing a rising threat from Salafi jihadist terrorism, inspired in no small part by the war in Gaza, as well as the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so definitely in the US and in countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, and France, right, the countries in Western Europe, certainly the terrorist threats are rising because of that dilemma where your resources are going down while the threats are diversifying. My understanding of the concern around the Olympics was people are very concerned right now about Moscow-style coordinated, complex terrorist attacks organized by a group like the Islamic State in Khorasan province. So this is the Islamic State kind of cell group in Afghanistan. Certainly, I think those kinds of incidents are possible in European cities and in the United States. Again, one of the major challenges, and this is where you're going to have to explain to me, what North Macedonia does in this space. One of the major challenges is always capability. So a lot of European capital cities, a lot of European countries are very good at limiting capability towards violence. That means really gun control. I believe a couple of years ago, there was a couple of mass shootings that happened in Serbia in which the government reacted by cracking down on firearms, if I remember correctly. That to me is the number one counterterrorism policy that governments can implement is arms control. If you don't have that, it becomes much more difficult. So I would say the threat is elevated in Europe. A lot of this is going to depend on how easy it is for terrorists to develop the capability to conduct a major act of violence, and that is where government and law enforcement can really play a role.
Well, our gun control policies, basically, we are not allowed to have guns, so we don't have that kind of law as in United States. We cannot go and buy a weapon whenever we want. We really need to have special permits, and they are very, very hard to get. So the weapon is limited. Buying weapons is limited, but we have other types of problems. For example, a lot of people who are fighters in Syria or other wars on the Middle East, they are coming back on the Balkans, back home, and those people can move freely. Not in Macedonia specifically. We have a new law that says that everyone who returns from foreign war have to be in jail. And of course, we were the first country that took these people back home and put it in jail. But there are a lot of people who are not. The law is not able to be applied on them, so they are free. In our neighboring country, it's the same situation. They can come back and still be free and be able to organize, reorganize, to promote, in a way, those kind of activities. So we have some period that we remember as not that good. For example, the migrant crisis after 2015. And the whole Europe was also on high alert. We were as well, because through our country, it was the channel for the migrants from Greece, Macedonia, Serbia, and so on. But now the atmosphere in Europe, it looks really like back in 2015. So can we expect more terrorist attacks? I am asking this because in these past months we saw, for example, Taylor Swift concert was postponed in Vienna but in the United Kingdom, everything went well on the concert. What can we expect? Should we, in the near future, should we cancel all the projects, all the big gatherings? And is this fear justified or not?
I don't think you should ever seek to cancel events. I mean, the Taylor Swift concert in Vienna, my understanding is that was a extremely serious situation. So you understand it, but I think the key is to continue and continue to build strong, robust, democratic societies that bring people in and don't push them out, and that is the best way to defeat noxious, divisive ideologies in the long term. You mentioned returning individuals from the Islamic State. I will tell you, it's a little bit outside of my expertise, because I have my hands so full with far right extremists that I can't focus on anything else. But I'll tell you, when you ask an average American counterterrorism scholar or an average Western European counterterrorism scholar what keeps them up at night, they will tell you it's the camps in northern Syria. The fact that we defeated this dangerous army in 2019 and we just left everybody there in camps and didn't really think what the next steps were going to be. So people are very concerned about radicalization occurring in those camps, and obviously radicalization occurring among returning citizens into Europe. My great fear, I mean, you mentioned migrant, the migrant crisis and the fear that people will, infiltrate countries. We deal with that concern a lot here in the United States. I'm sure you've heard about our southern border and concerns that individuals are going to are going to come across that border. My fear, and this is based on research that I've done and research that others have done, is most violence, most jihadist violence that occurs in Europe is perpetrated by Europeans. You look at the Paris attacks and the Brussels attacks. I mean, some of those individuals had traveled to Syria, but almost every incident that kind of defined that rise in ISIS violence around 2014 to 2017 was perpetrated by people from those countries who are radicalized by a foreign group. So, my concern is always, it's less about people who have traveled. It's more about people within our own countries, within our own communities, who for whatever reason are not settling into our ways of life, our cultures, and are deciding to act out in violence on behalf of foreign ideologies that are dangerous and violent. And so we really need to be thinking about our own communities, how we make sure we're protecting young people, make sure we're integrating young people, making sure we're creating these robust democracies, robust societies where everybody's included and everybody is moving forward together, as opposed to people are being left behind and therefore vulnerable to overtures from dangerous foreign groups. That is always my bigger concern, is it's the people who are already here rather than those who might come here. So that is why, I think in counterterrorism, we always need to look primarily internally rather than externally and think about what we can do to look after people who are here already.
And I have to ask you, because we have two active wars raging in the different parts of the world. One is on European soil, it's the Russian aggression on Ukraine, and the other one is Israeli Palestine or Gaza. We cannot even say it is a conflict now, because it's a much more than just conflict. From this point of view, the Palestinians are trapped inside Gaza and they cannot go out. But in that region, in Middle East, in almost every country around, there is another terrorist group. So they were operating in that region, but we can see occasionally that they go out of that region. For example, Moscow, Belgrade, these threats in Vienna, in Bratislava, as you mentioned, we saw earlier, Paris and Brussels, as you mentioned. But what is this war going to bring us everywhere in the world, us in Europe and to you in United States of America? What is the possibility of spill over that terrorist activities throughout the whole world?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. It's very frightening. You know, I first of all, regionally speaking, I really struggled to understand from the Israeli point of view how, strategically speaking, they believe that a good way to de-radicalize the region, to counter-radicalize young Palestinians, is to conduct a counterinsurgency in this manner. I really don't understand that logic. Obviously, people are being radicalized on the ground actively because of the violence that they're facing. And so that is going to spill over. Now, what we've seen in the US, and you and I are speaking today as the Democratic National Convention is happening in Chicago, is we've seen this very odd rapprochement between our kind of far left and pro-Gaza, kind of even pro-Hamas protesters. So there are videos circulating of protests occurring in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention, pro-Gaza, pro-Hamas protests, where people have carried Hamas flags. That is incredibly surreal to see Salafi jihadist groups being celebrated among the American left. That is, for those of us who have been studying this movement, for those of us, frankly, who are part of the American left, that is really shocking and upsetting. And so again, I mean, as I mentioned in the last question, from a group like Hamas's point of view, if you wanted to conduct a terrorist attack in the United States, it's unclear to me why you would try to infiltrate somebody into the country rather than communicate with these people who are already supporting your ideology on the ground. And so, absolutely, I expect we'll see spillover violence, we'll see acts of violence in Europe and the United States, continued acts of violence on behalf of that ideology. Of course, we also see it the other way around, right? We've also seen anti-Muslim violence, Islamophobic violence in the United States and in Europe in the past few months since October 7th. In the UK, in the past few weeks, we saw Islamophobic riots break out all over the country. Now, those were on behalf of white supremacist causes rather than kind of pro-Israel causes, but nevertheless, these things do coalesce. On the Russia-Ukraine war, early in the conflict, there was a lot of concern about, just as what happened in Syria, there was a lot of concern about far-right extremists going to the conflict, joining both sides, both the Russian invasion and certain units within the Ukrainian defense, most notably a group called the Azov Battalion, joining those units, getting training, and then returning to Europe and the US as radicalized and trained fighters. That has already happened. Sweden, before the full-scale invasion, Sweden faced a couple of bombings from individuals who had traveled to Russia to join a Nazi group there. And so it is possible, Christina, that the same issues, the same dynamics we've spoken about in the wake of the Syrian war, the Syrian civil war and the rise of the Islamic State in Syria, could occur as well in Europe and the United States among neo-Nazis and white supremacists who fought in Russia, Ukraine, on both sides. That is quite possible, and we'll have to deal with that whenever this conflict hopefully comes to an end.
I have to go back to Israeli and Gaza once again, because it's really, I will call it like humanitarian dilemma, because on one hand, all of those people who are stuck in Gaza, we really have to protect them somehow, and it's not fair. What is happening to them is a huge humanitarian crisis, and it's a humanitarian, I mean, I don't even have enough words to describe what is going there. It's very, very sad. But on the other hand, there is a terrorism threats and fear that may become even bigger. The threats may become even bigger. What is the right solution when we have cases like this specific region, like Middle East, and how can we help people in Gaza, and how can, at the same time, how to prevent spillover of the terrorism and possibility to move the terrorism from one place to another?
Christina, that is the million-dollar question, and I don't have a good answer for you. Let me contextualize a little bit why it's so difficult. Yes, we're talking about a counterterrorism campaign against a terrorist organization in Gaza, but we're also talking about a counterinsurgency in that region because this group is really embedding among the civilian population. Now, the US has lots of experience with counterinsurgencies, and we are really, really terrible at counterinsurgencies. So our history of recent war in the last 50 years, from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Iraq, is really a story of failure to fight those kind of conflicts, because typically you really want to fight those conflicts with military solutions, when in reality military solutions are not very effective. Now, Israel is clearly ignoring the lessons from the US lessons from Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. That lesson is, if you try to combat an embedded insurgent group with force, if you try to flatten cities in order to root out terrorists, you are going to create more radicalized individuals, and you are going to create a humanitarian catastrophe, and you are going to bring international opinion directly against you. And to be honest, Christina, if I sat there on October 6th, I could have predicted exactly that scenario. It is not hard to predict that this was going to happen. It's hard to predict we would have had such a catastrophic incident on October 7th, but it was not hard to predict that this would be the reaction and this would be how it would work out. This is exactly the wrong thing to do. I'm sympathetic to the Israeli cause because, of course, you have a serious threat against your population, and you have a terrorist group that is embedded in an incredibly frustrating way that you want to root out. But killing civilians en route to doing that is the wrong approach, because it achieves the opposite of what you want to do. How do you do it correctly? That is really hard. Let me give you an example of what did work, because the US, as you know, failed in all those counterinsurgencies, and eventually, during the late Obama and early Trump administration, I felt the US kind of stumbled upon a strategy that was working in Syria, which was find yourself a local partner in the region. This was the Syrian Defense Forces. Find yourself a local partner that is reliable, fund them with limited arms, with air support, and with intelligence, and let them fight their own fight on the ground without large kind of American boots on the ground. The reason why I think that worked is because obviously we defeated the Islamic State, but that is actually the exact same strategy that the US and the West has opted for in the war in Ukraine, right? They have identified, rather than fighting the Russian invasion themselves, they've identified a capable local partner, the Ukrainian army, which has been phenomenal. They've supported them with weapons and with intelligence support, and it's been phenomenal. I mean, it's not been perfect. We haven't obviously defeated the invaders, but we have fought off the invasion to large extent. That is the model, I think, of what works in counterinsurgency. How you do that in Palestine, I don't know, because we don't have that local partner. We don't have a partner inside, as far as I know, inside Gaza or the West Bank that has been proven to be reliable. that wants to work to eradicate the forces, that has the organizational capacity to defeat, Hamas. And so that's the challenge. To answer your question, I know I answered in a long-winded way. There is no perfect strategy to deal with this, but I do know for sure that the slaughter of civilians and the calculation is going to fail. Israel clearly has some kind of equation that they calculate. What is the number of civilians that we can kill in order to kill one Hamas fighter, in order to kill one high-level Hamas fighter? I think that equation they've got is way off. It's way off. They are willing to tolerate way too much civilian bloodshed, and it's going to cause more problems because it does every time.
And at the end, I would like to ask you, of course, a global question. It's a modern time. We have digitalization. We have new ways of communicating, more advanced ways of communicating. So as our services, we're all now we are part of NATO. We are part of some other groups, for example, Interpol. There is Europol. There are a lot of institutions and a lot of unions and pacts that make our countries connected and work together and give and get the informations. But at the same time, the terrorists have the same communicational methods. So who is in advantage in this modern world? Is it the services who are there to protect us, or the terrorists who also have the same ways of communicating, of spreading their propaganda, of recruiting? So for what group this modern time makes the job more easier?
It's a great question. Let me try to answer that in two different ways. One is, tactically speaking, terrorists have the advantage. The reason for that is they are revolutionaries. They are always going to be one step ahead. They are always going to define the innovations. They are always going to use new tools in ways that surprise us. There's a famous quote from I think a French counterinsurgent called David Galula, where he said, disorder is cheap, order is expensive. It's very cheap to create disorder. It's very hard to keep order. And so terrorists will always have the advantage in creating little acts or big acts that will upset our social fabric, that will destabilize society, that will evade law enforcement, will evade counterterrorism. The reason for that is, they're very good at using social media. They will be very good at using artificial intelligence to advance their ideologies and recruit. And they're very good at using what's called lone actor terrorism. So we spoke about instances like Moscow, right?
Yes.
Those are the rarity. More likely is incidents like, Bratislava, where you have an individual who's just underneath the law enforcement radar and pops up and conducts an attack that makes the community feel unsafe, right? That is a very effective way of creating disorder and making sure that society cannot kind of have these, cannot feel stable. So tactically, terrorists have the advantage. However, at a strategic level, it's important to note that terrorism is a strategy of the weak. It's a strategy of people who have decided that know that their ideologies are not sufficiently widely held that they can implement them in policy forums. It is a strategy used by people who have determined that political means won't work for them. They have to opt for violence. And so terrorism is almost a tribute to the strength of our societies, the strength of our democracies, the strength of our communities, that terrorists with these poisonous ideologies feel that they have to opt for violence. And so they will always have the advantage tactically, but strategically speaking, as long as we stay united, as long as we react to violence with unity, as long as we react to poisonous and divisive ideologies with rejection, It is impossible, in my opinion, for terrorism to win. The way terrorists win is by so dividing society that people determine that they have to take the terrorists' side.
So are not our societies divided at this moment? Because we saw that on European soil as well earlier this year. Now we see it in your political campaign. So are we more divided than we've ever been?
In the US, certainly yes. I don't think Europe is quite that far gone yet. I mean, the story in the US, Christina, is a story where violent forces have been mainstreamed. Right? January 6th is a story of terrorism and violence being thrust into the mainstream by actors who lost in the political system and therefore felt that they needed violence, and that then were excused when they used violence. That is the existential threat, right? It's not the violence itself, it's what violence does to society. And so in the US, I believe that we have an election in 2.5 weeks. I believe it's a critical election. It's a critical moment for democracy in our country. Either violent main forces will win, or those of us who reject violence and reject authoritarianism will succeed in that. And the US, I think will provide a model. It will provide a model for whether, autocratic and violent forces in Europe have permission to continue their activities, or whether they are rejected as well. And so, yes, we're very divided. Yes, terrorism is being mainstreamed, but I still believe, I always say, whenever I hear people get very pessimistic about terrorism or very cynical, I always say, it's important to remember there's many more of us than there are of them, always. And if we can find unity, and if we can find the same passion and energy that they have, we will be okay. And so that's what I hang my hat on. And you know what? Working in terrorism, Christina, sometimes you wake up pessimistic, sometimes you wake up optimistic, but I woke up on the right side of the bed this morning. Today I'm optimistic, so...
I'm so glad to hear that. I needed some optimism for the end of this interview, because other way we will just create some inner panic that we really don't want to, because we all need to feel safe everywhere we go. We have some similar events even before the attack on Congress. We have similar event here. It was attacked on Macedonian parliament. We still call that day Bloody Thursday, but let's hope everything is now behind us. So thanks God we had 2 elections after that were just fine. So let's hope that nothing of that kind will happen, not here and not in your country ever again, because as I said, security is the most important thing that we have to
I agree. God willing.
So Mr. Ware, thank you very much for this interview. It was lovely talking to you. So I hope we will have the chance to talk again, but not the chance to talk after some terrorist attack, but maybe after some successful case of preventing terrorist attacks.
That sounds like a great plan. I look forward to joining the show again. After, as you say, after some successes rather than after some failures.
And of course, I hope you're a very calm campaign and calm people during the campaign, because it is very important. That's how all of us, that's how we protect the democracies in our countries. Thank you very much again for this interview.
Thank you.
Ви благодарам за вниманието со кое не следевте Лабиринт и понатаму продолжува да ги следи безбедносните прашања, но и можните решенија. Celата содржина гледајте на каналите на idmedia.mk и не заборавајте да се потпишете и на нашиот YouTube канал. Довидување до следната недела.